Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Wellware Podcast. Conrad Ruiz here, and today I have with me Jonathan Tai. Jonathan Tai, who aptly goes by JT, is a very close friend of mine. He and I have known each other since our time both at WPI. And during that time, I knew JT as a robotics engineer. And for that time since, I also knew him to be involved in entrepreneurial activities. I'll let him speak more on that in a little bit. But right now, my claim of joy is that I gotten a chance to work with JT as a product manager through the production of my software product. And what I want to, my testament to wanting to be on this podcast episode today with JT is to share with you about what it's like working with him and why he's such an awesome guy to work with within the product management space. To that end, JT, welcome.
Thanks, Conrad. Yeah. Like you say, I've sort of been doing the robotics thing for a while before I did the product thing. That's what I graduated from WPI with. Realistically, I moved into product because, you get out of college for engineering, you go into engineering and it's not really what you expect. You're not really doing those cool things. At the end of the day, there's a lot of people who put a lot of more effort into very specific engineering stuff that you found out you probably should have done. You do some reflection. You're like, what did you do in college? And then you go, oh, well, I found myself doing a lot more systems. That's kind of what the degree was. I was good at talking to people. I had a little background in performance. And I was like, how do you put those two things together, right? Empathy, skills, and systems, knowledge of some technology. It ends up being product. So between that and my time running an Actis back at school, I was like, this is probably the right way to go. So I was like, very quickly after year one, I got in touch with the product manager of the company that I was with at the time. He's like, yeah, sure, we'll get you in. And then it's been sort of bouncing back and forth between robotics industry until I was like, I should probably do this myself because I'm not going to get the right experience. And so I've been in and out of projects. One of them has been yours. It's been a great time.
It's been a great time. And I want to highlight that as much as we've been very close friends since graduation, I can think back to when I first sat down with you and I was like, JT, I want to share with you what I've been working on. And I want to share with you in particular how frustrated I was. Because I think at that time, this was when before I even had a chance to sit down with someone like you to discuss what product management even meant, I had already dived into the workflow of just creating and developing product. Now, I did so with a co-founder. We had a sort of technical, non-technical co-founding relationship going on. I focused more on the business side. He focused more on the development side. And as a result of that, by proxy of me just being more of a business leader and sort of in terms of what the market was telling us we needed to build, that's what I just kind of directed my co-founder then towards. Things didn't work out. We had a lot of scope creep. Bunch of stuff fell apart. I've got a whole story dedicated to that. But
I remember. Yeah.
And I shared about it in kind, and it was tough. But I still managed to pursue the product. And at that point, I remember that I actually went up to you and I said, JT, what could I be doing differently? And that's when you made me aware of, and I'll grab my mug here and drink. That's when you made me aware that you understood product management. And then you started to kind of guide me through this initial journey that I had never really understood prior. And I'd like to talk about that a lot right now.
Sure. Shall we start? Let's start with, you want to start with my approach with people in that situation? Because I think a lot of people are kind of like you, right? Most people who are founders, most people have ideas, right? I think everyone is a founder. Everyone's an idea person. The question is whether or not you have the resources to put that down, not only to page, but to whatever developmental building sort of type of place you have to put it. So everybody has ideas, right? So the question is, if you have the resources, how do you get there, right? I think a lot of people, because of how we look at how Silicon Valley happened, how we look at some service-based businesses, how we look at some restaurants and stuff like that as sort of our foundational proving grounds of how these things work. They just we'll just go find somebody and we'll just build it. And in that way, we often find that you spend a lot of time and energy doing something you think is right. You get to this point where, oh no, it's suddenly too complex. And you tried to solve 4 or 5 different things and 20 different people are telling you that you should have done it this way. You're like, what is the right thing? And so the art of product management, I say, is having a philosophy of development, right? And everybody all good product managers usually have their own. I would say mine starts from saying, let's actually understand what you're trying to build, right? I think the traditional entrepreneur's conversation says, oh, you've got to understand your customer. You got to understand your problem. You've got to understand your solution to the problem. And I say, yes, that's probably a good start, right? But that's a good start to build anything. But if you want to build something that's sustainable, you have to look a little bit further than that, the way I see it. There's a couple more details under that layer that are worth knowing. And also you have to understand that those don't give you that final product, right? What those give you is the first prototype. What I like to call simple, easy, cheap, right? A lot of people, I'm sure you and most of your listeners probably have heard of MVP, right? So minimum viable product. I think that's a good idea. But it's not really that great of a way to explain what it is you're trying to do for your customers, right? MVPs, oftentimes, I like to use the example like a car, right? What is the MVP of a car? Like conceptually, the MVP of a car is the two axles with the wheels and like an axle in between of it, right? It doesn't really tell me anything. It rolls, right? That's just about it.
Right. Is it a skateboard?
Right, exactly. Well, so that's what the simplest, easiest, cheapest thing would be, right? Like you don't have to go through the engineering to do all that. A skateboard is a lot easier and you can put stuff on it. It gives the idea of that across, right? The difference between MVP, simple, easy, cheap being the cost as well as the capability to express an idea. So that I would say is sort of where I would say most founders need to start. And for you, I remember we sort of, the way we went about that was like, okay, how do we understand what our customer workflow is? Because I think you, unlike most founders, were actually very clear about the kind of person that you wanted to hit, because those folks who are high value networkers were you, right? It's kind of a big part of what you do. And so we could very quickly and easily come up with this idea and this picture and this story about how people would ideally interact with your problem. So that part was pretty easy for you. And then, but the part of distilling that down into what is the simplest, easiest, cheapest thing to make was kind of where we sort of, I think, found the most time at the very beginning.
And you brought me through this. I'm looking at it in hindsight. It's so funny to have the words for it now and before not really know what I was asking you for. But you brought up a question for me in this particular frame. You said, what does your minimum viable product require? And what you did was you basically started to set expectations for, okay, tell me what are the components, like really start to break down what minimum viable even essentially entails. And what was surprising for me when we started getting into that conversation was I could tell you some end deliverables as a minimum viable product. I could tell you some very basic experiences that needed to be understood. But once we start getting into the nitty gritty things, this is where things get kind of interesting. You start to ask, like, what is the actual user interface experience? What is the expected dialogue? How are people going to respond when they have to click a button here and get a modal pop up there? And you started to really flesh that out into what we have now as the MVP of this product. And that was something that I didn't count on, both in terms of the time it was going to take, the toil in terms of clarity and specification, and why that was also important, because you could think, oh, we'll get those details figured out. Okay, by who? By the most expensive person on the team? By the guy whose job it is to literally develop the code? Is it's the responsibility of the UX UI designer to just kind of come up with the solution for what makes a good UX experience? Of course, their input matters, but sometimes they're following a particular track of what they think makes sense. And that's not entirely the same as what you and I ended up sitting down on together and defining as the actual product.
Yeah, and I'd say, like, it's most of the time, right? It's typically the founder's job to be the product manager, right? Which is why I like to step in less as a, hey, I'm going to be your product manager, and more as like, let me teach you some of the concepts that you need to know to do this better. Because at the end of the day, the best I can do, like when people hire me to be the product manager, I'm really the translator. What is going on? I'm the translator from your vision as a founder into something that your developers, your designers, and your implementers and your customer service people can understand. And I'm also taking that and creating some infrastructure that the company can communicate around in order to understand what it is they need to build, right? All those details, who gets to decide those details and under what context, right? But when it comes to like founders who need product management help, it's really important to me that like those like things that you talked about are things that I teach, right? Like, yes, you have this grand idea. How do you build burden of proof for those details, right? Why should you choose a modal to be a certain way? And before you even get there, why do you need a modal in the first place, right? There's a pretty big conversation I think that's worth having with most founders about like, okay, what is your core user experience? And we spent a lot of time on this. What is the one thing, or maybe three things, I'll allow three, maybe, usually one thing that your users or your customers are coming to you for? How do you really detail the specific, let's say the minimum possible steps they need to do in order to get from A to Z, right? Like
I'm laughing because I remember back to like the first days of founding where it was like, oh my God, I want them to do this and this and this and this and this. And now I'm like, no, I need this one experience to be freaking flawless. And that's all I'm asking for right now. JT, I say this with love. Your talk is so cheap in the sense that you are not a verbal translator of these things. You are an architectural translator of these things. You draw diagrams, workflows, you build entire databases, you structure those databases, you create an entire project and task management system within that. Like, it's not just I am translating what the product owner or the founder in this case, or the client, the stakeholder wants. I'm literally designing the entire infrastructure, as you said, in which the entire team communicates in order to establish. And of course, development has its own roles to play in terms of defining, hey, guys, every week we're going to groom. Every week we're going to, as part of our check-ins, the other things I need to make sure that we resolve, release versus non-releasing component. Like, that's fine. But you're also setting that tone right alongside the developer so that you and him are on the same page, or they, in terms of whatever context you may be working with. And that then also triages the designer too, in terms of saying, hey, Daphne, in this case, where are you with this particular version given you? And I love, like, just forgive me, I don't want to digress, but it was so important just in the last couple of months, I remember, where we had to communicate just within a design framework. Hey, there is what we need to build for, what we need to actually design for, what we need to tell development to do, versus what may be ideations and things we can explore, because those are important. And that creativity is very helpful, especially for someone whose literal design structure and sort of workflow is to just create, like, spontaneously. Like, that's Daphne's genius. Yeah. But at the same time, we want those versions architecturally separated from the designs in which development needs to specifically look at. Any more information that development receives only acts as confusion, not as inspiration.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's multiple angles to it. Also, before I continue, let me change my lights. It's getting yellower and yellower as we go. Oh, nope, that's better. There we go. Now I look normal. There's a lot of different ways to look at that too, right? Like, I would say, like, product management is really, I would say, is like the center of the spokes of the wheel, right? Like, if the founder turns the axle, the spokes of the wheel need to be connected in order for the wheel to actually spin. Otherwise, you're a free spinning core of a wheel. Each spoke needs to handle its own forces, right? And so in the terms of a developer or designer, they only really want to hear certain things, and then we'll have certain questions that it's my job then to relate to all the rest of the information and to, communicate to the rest of the team as they need. So when thinking about, let's say, a software development team, right, you typically have a UI UX designer, you have one developer, you have one customer success person, you have one, visionary, and then you have somebody that manages the actual work. And oftentimes the product manager, the visionary is typically the founder, the product manager is typically the work management person, and the customer success person until specific customer success person comes into place. That means you're taking in information, but you also got to deal it out. Without a physical infrastructure to do that, I would get lost just as much as probably you would, or anybody would, on what to do. And so I think a lot of founding teams tend to, like, they might have to-do lists, right? And you can have to-do lists, but to-do lists are they're a single column of things to do. Okay, sure. You can then break it down into maybe different sections of the to-do list. You can put tags on it. But as soon as you do that, you're now asking the question, you now have to have answers for what those sections are and why you're doing it, right? Because with sections, you must have priority, which sort of cascades into this big whole picture of what is your product, right? And if you don't think of that actively, I feel like having a system to manage work that, you're not really truly managing. You don't really understand what's going on outside of, this is the next thing on the do list. Why are we doing it? Because it's next. Okay, sure. Then where are you going? Right. Without sounding too tautological, I feel like I'm almost talking in circles about what you need to do first here. You're right though. The infrastructural aspect is very important to what I do. And in part of like teaching other founders, this is one of probably the first things I start with is like, hey, how do you understand your product and how do you communicate that to your people? I helped set up this for somebody who I met in San Francisco doing like a different robotics type of thing. And he came to me, he was like, what? I know what I need to do. I have these to-do lists, but like, I don't know how to give people the information that they need for those tasks, right? I can tell them, I don't really want to write down full paragraphs, right? And I don't know how to help teams work together on the same items, right? Okay, great. Well, here's X number of softwares. I mean, the most popular, I told him, because he's in Silicon Valley, we have these linear. But let's say, okay, well, let's break down your goal, right? Because he's a very early stage startup, they're only doing basically VC necessitated number-based implementations and no real product development yet. So this is the thing that you want to get to, right? You've already listed to me what tasks you want to do, right? But you can't just say, hey, vision person, go develop an algorithm that helps me check for little iron parts, right? There's more to it than that. Underneath that, the developer needs to understand, okay, what are the specifics around the iron parts that we're checking for? What is the environment that we're checking for? Are there other like light parameters and stuff like that? Hardware, differences, and how does that interface with the rest of the stuff? Those are in his case, the subtasks that he needs to define before he even goes to them. Once that's done, you say, okay, cool. Here, how much time dev do you think this will take? And then you have your timeline. And I feel like I'm jumping into slightly other topics, but you get the idea.
Part of me is just so grateful that I'm not operating in a type of software to hardware development that starts to blend into like the physical reality of diagnostics, on such a hard line level. And I'm sure for something like iron part measurement, you start to get into a desire to build something that's not only just a proof of concept, probably a proof to scale. And God help me if I had to get, but your point is that the fundamental understandings behind product management exist even when I'm trying to do something as simple as send an email to 2 people. Even that, surprisingly, as much as I'm going to admit, but based on my experience, requires a lot of context. And there's almost a desire as a founder to say, what is the minimum viable context that I need to provide in order to get this thing executed successfully? And it's surprisingly not minimal. There's a lot involved, and maybe having the systems instructors help to bring that total level of information down so that you're not spending so much time just over elaborating, and that makes total sense, so that you can get really efficient with this workflow. I think you do an incredible job of that from an infrastructure standpoint. There's still a lot of work to do. Every little thing needs to be accounted for. I just submitted a comment today saying, hey, notice how the margins of the email when I write them, if I get to if I'm on the first character and my cursor's to the left of that first character, I can't see it because of the black line that's designed to create a boundary for where I'm allowed to even write. And so now I have to have a conversation about user experience to say, hey, listen, I want that margin to just stretch a little bit enough just so I can see the cursor when I'm at that particular point to the left of the first character, right? And I went to Gmail as inspiration to say, hey, look how they do it, right? Like just literally our interface is email, right? As an overlay. So it's notices like that again, do you account for that when you sat down and you worked with the founder to put together the definition of what is the basic requirement for the body of an email that you're essentially going to be creating or confirming before you hit send introduction? No, maybe not. You might miss out on that little detail, but once you see it, you then have to put into documentation for the developer's workflow to say, hey, Ben, I need you to focus on this, right? And if you have any questions and need something, we can have a dialogue in the task management profile within this particular request.
Yeah, without something that you can prove as ground truth, right? It's difficult for you to tell anybody what you need to do, and honestly, you're going to make your team mad because tomorrow you're going to change your mind, right? You're going to forget. Like, and nothing to you. Everybody's human, right? This is why we all try to carry notebooks, and that's why every rise and grinder says they have like a particular method to rise and grind, and it's something to track it by, because your ground truth helps you do what you do. But when you're working with other people with other skills in order to best communicate what you want to do, that is the best way to do it, right? And that's why you have infrastructural systems like the Notion database that we work with, or maybe even like just a chart sometimes is all you need. Other popular tools, ClickUp, Asana, Linear, all that stuff, right? That's what those are.
They all exist to do the same function. Some just give you more design infrastructure already baked in. Maybe you have to explore that infrastructure. Maybe it's already familiar to. Maybe you've done it all yourself manually, and now there's something that's doing it automatically for you. Like, oh my God, what a pleasant product experience. Like, oh my God, how full circle. To that end, JT, I want to show appreciation for how you've defined a certain meta layer to that whole roadmap, where you don't shy away from just saying, all right, here's the ClickUp experience. There's also, hey, here's the meta behind this ClickUp experience that I'm about to correct you. In this case, you did it within Notion, but still, outside of Notion itself, you did the same thing within Asana when we were navigating our operations in Asana, which I know that we're going to be transversing out of. Not because we hate it, just because it's better to keep everything consolidated in one house. And when you know how to do that, do it. But still, my point was the meta structure, the how-to of how-to, the system behind the system. That is something that I don't know how else to take for granted, other than I'm grateful that you're able to explain that all to me, especially at my pace, at a time in which I was only just trying to first understand, like, hey, JT, can you just help me get this product out the door? Like, can you help me get MVP? And then you were like, wait, hold on a minute. Database structuring in this particular design is freaking awesome. And maybe it's just the operator in me going like, haha, fellow nerd, because you just described it, right? PMing can exist whether the product is you, or the product is a business, or the product is a service line, not necessarily just a particular software as a service application. It could be a whole host of things. Product can be very broadly defined. But still, you showcase a meta to PMing specifically that I think is phenomenally well accounted for.
Thank you. I appreciate those words, man. And realistically, I think that's the thing that most founders miss, right? Because it's easy to say code the button. But like, what does the button relate to, right? If we're asking the button to do a thing, does that button, how do you get to that button? And then when the button leads you there, what else has changed in the system for people to do that? You want to get into it a little bit? We could give the brief one to the listeners. Up to you. Yes. Okay. Cool. The specific meta structure that I run with is based off of a pretty popular sort of user experience focused meta structure. I'll forget the guy, but I'll link you the guy who I picked this up from. It was basically, you want to think from your user's experience at its ideal form, right? The way I like to say it, imagine a script that defines a quick 30-second, 1-minute video ad that displays the experience that your users will have going through the use of their product with you. The use of your product with them. And in that script, you'll be able to divulge a handful of major core experiences. I like to keep the 5, but sometimes you go more than that, and you'll often discover a lot more as you go along. Sort of putting yourself very empathetically into somebody's shoes and seeing how your product interacts with their product. Those bigger experiences, right? I like to call sort of your like major initiatives, right? After you have those major initiatives, you can then say, okay, what do these mean, right? In your case with Loop, right? One of the big, actually, let me just pull it up so I don't speak poorly. Here we go. Let's see, Notion.
And this is where the genius is, right? I don't have to remember all of this. I wrote it all down.
Yeah, well, you're right. You don't have to search your mind palace. I don't have one of those. I could never do it. Those major initiatives often fall under can sometimes fall under bigger product epics, right? And so you can think of an epic kind of like a story, like a big story. So, right, if your big experience vision, which is like your biggest story, typically comes with some mini stories. You could think of as character almost, if you were to think like Oedipus, right? Those bigger stories you break down into your major initiatives. The major initiatives are the key steps that build into the story, right? If Humpty Dumpty fell off a wall, Well, how did he get up there in the first place? What kind of a wall was he sitting on? And why was he trying to fall off the wall in the first place? Then from those initiatives, you can say, okay, well, we can look at the individual features within those initiatives that make those experiences, the experience that you want, right? So Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, right? Well, we knew he got up there because he climbed up there because there's a ladder over there. We knew when he fell because he tipped over, and Humpty Dumpty's made a certain way. That's a part. The way he's weighted, that's a feature. The ladder's a feature, right? The shoes he was wearing, a feature. Okay, well, in order for those to exist, there must be requirements for that. To use a more realistic, let's use Loop as a more real example than fairy tales. Let's say your product epic here is making introductions, right? That's the core of what you do, right? In order to do that, the core of that was sending an introduction. That's the only thing that users are probably going to be doing for, the first maybe 10 or 20 or so interactions. That's probably what they're going to want to do, right? So we can define that initiative as the value added of that initiative being sending great introductions is a process that requires a lot of attention and detail. And for you, that was like a laborious, concise effort that was relatively repeatable. Okay, we understand what the value added here is. We understand how that fits into the general epic of like, hey, making introductions, we want people to do. Cool. What's the feature that's going to help us do that? In our case, we were able to tighten it down to one single feature. That was just the introduction maker, right? It was the thing. And within those features, the requirements are the introduction maker must do. Let's get a list here.
Must be able off the top of my head. Here's where it's fun to write it down versus to have to think about it, because I'm sure I'm not going to miss something, right? And this was the case that we dealt with, right? Every single time. So something as simple as you got to make an introduction, right? Top of your head, what would you think? I got to select contacts. I got to send. I have to like draft an email. I have to hit send. And then all of a sudden you start to sort of flesh that out further, and you go, well, wait, hold on a minute. When I'm sending an email, I have to think about the subject line and the body, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Well, how do I get the contacts in there? All right, well, I have to have a contacts database. So I need to have a contacts database. It's a feature. And that I have to be able to add new contacts to the database right then and there. How else am I going to do it? Well, maybe I want to upload a bunch of contacts. And so the story starts to unravel in all these different sub branches, right? Even though we had just one thing we had to do, right?
We start there, right? And you go like, okay, well, is the contact database, is that the same thing as the introduction maker? Is that even a part of making introductions? We decided no, right? That ended up in its own epic of like managing your personal information is where we put that, because your contacts are technically part of, we put under managing your network. We realized that the network effect was actually a really important part of the story and the experience vision you wanted to tell, right? Yeah, and so those then you get to the creative questions, right? Are your contacts your personal information, or is it a completely separate experience you want to divulge? And that's what a system like this exists to tell, right? You start with your core focus, you break it out, and you're like, okay, what do we need to support this one thing? And then you cut and you cut and you cut. Was there something that you cut that we remember we cut that you like really, really wanted? Do you remember what any of those? I think I have a couple here written down.
What did we cut? Tell me something that we wrote down that I totally must have forgotten. Deserted from my mind.
I remember something that there are two things. One we actually started without and decided to put back in, and then one that we cut. We really wanted to have first, but then eventually removed, and that was the opt-ins for introductions, right? And then the one that we initially didn't have and then put back in was unsubscriptions.
Well, we started to get into, and this was a really interesting conversation with Ben as well, because he ended up influencing a lot of the discussion around cardinality, right? And what you brought up together, like the way that you ended up simplifying it for me when you said, what's that 30-second to 1 minute sort of advertisement experience of like, yay, the client got what they wanted, or the user in this case, you were like, happy path, right? What's the happy path versus what are all the potential unhappy paths? Because there's many unhappy ways in which a solution can be experienced ultimately. I may not have the right contact. Maybe I can't add them. And run into all these problems. There's ways to eliminate or resolve those unhappy paths. But when you introduce cardinality, you get to this really interesting, especially in introductions, you get to this really interesting dynamic of, well, not every introduction ends up happy-go-lucky. Sometimes one person doesn't never respond, or one person does respond and they have both people maybe give big feedback, but maybe your unhappy situation they're in, the sort of diversion of both people saying positive things is one person has something negative to say, right? Or critical or unhappy about, the situation. That's like, what do you want to do about that? We talked about that. We ended up talking about that a lot more on the feedback side of things, because that's what we were ultimately able to implement. But we then had the same sort of parallel conversation around how double opt-ins are going to go through the same exact storyline, just inverse, right? They're going to happen pre-intro.
Well, I mean, the reason why we did that for feedback specifically was because in the type of experience you wanted to offer, right, the feedback was the core part, one of the core pieces of the introduction experience that you wanted your users and the people who were getting the introductions, right, to actually have. Whereas opt-ins, we realized, were realistically happening already outside of the making of an introduction, right? It wasn't entirely necessary for you to do that. Eventually, would be nice. And so we were like, okay, cool. Well, how much time do we have? When do we want to put it out? If you had enough time, sure, you could have included that. But you were like, let's get it done as soon as possible. Let's get this into people's hands, which is a philosophy I personally agree with. And then you can now we'll probably have more data on whether or not people actually care about
that. That premise of when is enough is fascinating to me in the realm of production for, I mean, anything at this point, but especially for something like a product, because you certainly want to define what does the market want to initially experience to kind of, and this is where the sort of the business logic comes in, right? And again, fun having that conversation with the PM, because you're looking at not just the business logic of, oh, it would be really nice if, and the clients would be really happy with it. This would solve an incredible pain point if, okay, that's all great, but now let's break all of those requests into the logistics of actually setting that down as a requirement, let alone making that request to a developer to say, hey, Ben, how long do you think this is going to take? Right?
Yeah.
And that I, again, find that to be a fascinating conversation, because it starts to reveal a lot of the truth behind what is it really going to take to see this thing get put together, short of me putting in sweat, blood, and tears that I may not be able to personally produce.
It's a fun balance, right? So I mean, I think a lot of the folks in the startup scene that I've talked to tend to just go like, I want it then, and then you end up with a lot of problems on the development side because of that, right? Because developers have to cut corners, they create tech debt, they do band-aids in order to do that, or designers kind of like go like, sure, this is close enough, and your sort of developer kind of figures it out while they do that, right? In order to meet those deadlines. Coupled with like not great definition, typically when that happens. If you have good definition and you do that, maybe it's excusable. I would hate it personally, but the way the math, I would say, should be done really is you do start with that, unfortunately, right? You start with a, hey, when do I want it as a founder want it to be done, right? You do unfortunately have to calculate the number of hours that you have with your developers and your designers, right? They can only do so much work. It is labor, right? I consider developers kind of like almost the same as physical, like picking labor, right? That you can only move so fast. Things will happen, bottles will explode, code will fail, and you have to account for those contingencies. And the developer's time is broken into communicating, documenting, testing, right? Designing and writing, right? And so it's not just coding, right? Within that, okay, so let's say a developer only has 8 hours a day. Let's say you have a developer for 8 hours a day. If your feature takes more than 8 hours of work and you only give them a day, you're not going to get your whole feature, which sort of goes back to the reason why it's important to understand your experience from the top to the bottom, what kind of requirements are necessary, because those requirements are going to be used to measure how much time a developer will take. You're going to take those requirements, you're going to go, hey, dev, hey, person who's a builder, hey, person whose labor I'm buying, how long will it take for you to do this? Right? They have the knowledge to understand, hopefully, your clearly written requirement, and to say, oh yeah, I can build a database that has these things and have an interface with this particular user UI that we now have to build from scratch. It'll take me, this is like a 4-hour task, this is like a 10-hour task. Oh, but this will also need like 2 days of testing and this, that. And cool, now you have a realistic timeline on what it'll take to develop. If you don't like that, that means you got to cut features, right? As somebody, and this is my empathy for like developers coming from when I was doing that kind of work. this stuff is way more complex than like most people expect, right? And the type of problems in kind of like how we walked into it with like Google authentication, right? Those types of issues are deep enough where if you don't do it right the first time, it causes you way problems down the line, right? Which means that you got to trust the person who's implementing it. And if the person who's implementing it, it says this is going to take longer than you need, than you think, then it's time to make concessions, right? Okay, so in order to release on time, you cut a bunch of features. Now your product doesn't feel as nice. What do? You can still, my opinion is that in the conversation of release timing, calculate release timing, people don't consider communication about release at all. Because at the end of the day, I do believe that a well-written letter and a well-written sort of patch notes, if you will, to your customer will cover pretty much it, right? And all that plus, a line of communication where your customers can come to you, right?
I don't want to digress and highlight how, like, in sort of the off world of non-well-aware software development, my number one issue in service delivery is a communication breakdown.
It's hard. It's really hard. And also, like,
it's so fundamental.
Yeah.
As much as it is complicated and in some cases complex. And in any case, even when you set just the basic expectation of like, just report back, right? Just follow up, just check in, just report. You'd be amazed. Like, that's just the first half of the battle is just providing information, let alone expecting certain information to be provided back in response. I mean, right? Like communication 101, but now you're bringing it to a whole other level. You're bringing it to a very technical system, a very technical scope of what needs to be delivered. And yeah, as an owner, I will admit I'm out of the loop there a little bit, right? I'm putting a little bit of blind faith, but I digress. I think we have seen that Ben as a developer has been not only more than honest with us, but also incredibly educative in his own right about like, hey guys, expectations, issues, problems, things we have to solve, things that he didn't know until he knew. And then him sort of going back and saying, hey, remember when I said da da da? Well, it turns out that wasn't the truth, but that wasn't the case. We actually have a solution, or it turns out that this solution doesn't actually exist. And so fascinating to me watching that whole process not only be experienced, but then documented and reflected in hindsight. And I know that kind of, again, not trying to digress into the broader aspects of well-aware, but I really, really appreciate it about you guys.
Well, going back into ground truth, right? What does it mean to have good product management? It's having that ground truth, being able to go back and say, hey, we had this conversation. We thought it was this. We did it. And now we know what we can change it to, right? We have all these hypotheses. We have all these requirements that we're now going to be like, oops, they were wrong. But, we didn't spend $1 million trying to build everything. We just did those couple things because we decided on a priority. We can go back and change it. Yeah, it's like, and this is what I say when it comes to product management, right? The core is empathy and communication. And the methods are these infrastructures and these philosophies and these thought processes. And the results is the driving of the work, right? The driving, the translation of work. That's the result. Without the empathy, there's no way to sort of listen to the founder. There's no way to communicate with the developer. There's no way of understanding your customer and the problem. Right? Without the infrastructure, there's no way of setting proof. There's no way of having a debate realistically. And without those things, you can't get those results that you want. Right? You can't deliver.
JT, thank you for being you. What can the people listening do to learn more about you and contact you if they so need to?
I'm in the process of setting some legal infrastructure for myself up. But in the meantime, it's a good idea to put my phone number out there. I'll put my email out there so I don't get bombarded with a bunch of texts. You can get in touch with me at jltjonathan@gmail.com. That's Jonathan spelled with an A at the end and not an O. I didn't know that was common. Apparently it is common here in Tennessee. It's a wild thing that I found out recently. And without the H at the front. So JONATHAN @gmail.com. JLTJONATHAN @gmail.com. I am also on LinkedIn. Jonathan Tai is the full name. I think my LinkedIn handle is actually JAYLTAI. But I'm sure if you did a quick search on,
I'm gonna grab all these links and put them
there's gonna
down
be
somewhere.
links and stuff, I'm sure.
Yeah.
That's the best way to reach me right now. Once I get the rest of my legal structures set up, I'm sure to update everybody about this, and everyone will hear more. Yeah, if anyone's got like, I'm super open to just being a resource for people. The working with folks, the making money, that comes secondary. I'm super into just like helping people get their things out there. It's just helping people help people. That's me, I think, without tooting my own horn a little bit. That felt weird to say. If you want to talk about your product, if you have an idea you just want to talk about, if you want to talk about literally anything else, I'm really interested in meeting people. So, get in touch.
I can vouch for everything JT has to say. And if anyone knows me and has my contact information, feel free to request an introduction for me, and I will make sure it goes through via the very product that JT has helped put together.
We'll use Loop.
In kind, again, really appreciate you being here, JT. Really appreciate the time together. Until next time.
Until next time. Happy listening.